The first thing you need to know is that the room was already quiet when my son decided to raise his voice, and that silence snapped like a dry twig the moment his mother's lawyer said my name. I'd been trying to act invisible since the morning, to be the kind of shadow no one bothers to point at. That was my plan when I shaved carefully, pressed a suit that smelled faintly of cedar balls and moth repellent, and drove my old Honda up to the hilltop chapel where wealth parks nose to tail like show horses. I slipped into the last pew and pretended to study the stained glass. It was easier than studying faces I used to know. The windows offered a story older than any of ours, saints in blues and reds, kindness painted into light, while down on the floor the story being told about Brianna was all angles and numbers, headlines and milestones. The language of people who trade hours for power and never look back. I had promised myself I wouldn't relive our whole life during this service. But memory is a poorly trained dog. It comes when it wants, sits when it pleases. It found me on the drive over, too, when the phone call from the law office kept replaying in the empty car. Mr. Flores, we regret to inform you, the kind of sentence that empties out your chest and leaves the rib cage ringing. If you want the long version, and I suspect you do, because you're still listening, then picture this: a cramped apartment kitchen with linoleum curling at the corners, one coffee cup chipped around the rim, and a neighbor who believes yelling produces competence. Picture a 65-year-old man, brown wrists damp with dishwater, answering the landline he should have replaced with a cell years ago, and then sitting down hard in a chair that complains because that's what old furniture does. The woman on the line says the name Brianna Elizabeth, and suddenly February 30-odd years ago is back, Bri in a red coat, arguing fairness into a diner so dingy it made your tongue feel like a nickel. That was how she was, my ex-wife. She carried a fuse and a match in the same hand, and you never knew which you'd get. She could pluck a problem like a weed and leave the soil better than she found it. She could also grind a grudge to powder and scatter it on her oatmeal. When she chose me, I thought luck had mistaken me for someone else. When she left, I told myself she was correcting the error. By afternoon, the chapel was full of people who had learned to wear grief like a tailored suit. They dabbed eyes without disturbing makeup, shook hands without holding on. I could feel the heat of the whispers when Dustin spotted me, the kind of warmth that doesn't comfort. He cut down the aisle fast, a sleek boat parting a quiet lake. "What are you doing here?" he said before his loafers stopped moving. Head swiveled. Money breathes differently in a room. You can hear it when silence arrives. "I came to say goodbye," I said, because it was true and there wasn't time to build a better sentence. "You don't get to say that." He didn't shout yet. He saved that for later. "You forfeited goodbyes when you walked away." We could have argued the math in that statement, who left first, who stayed the longest, but we were standing on sacred carpet and a mortician was looking at us the way a librarian looks at teenagers. I told him I'd sit quietly and keep my hands folded. He told me to leave. We held each other's eyes until we both remembered where we were. The service did its work. There were verses and violins and eulogies that braided numbers into virtue, 34 million in assets, contracts in 4 states, 300 jobs created. I kept waiting for someone to say what else she was, and sometimes I thought I heard it hiding in the spaces between sentences. They said determined when they meant stubborn, visionary when they meant sleepless, generous when they meant guilty. I didn't blame them. The dead deserve the best version of themselves on days like this. Afterward, I tried to slip out. That was when the lawyer found me. "Mr. Flores?" He had the kind of handshake that reassures and the kind of suit that suggests professional success without screaming it. "Dan Morrison, your presence is required at the reading." Required. Dustin had materialized, quick as weather. "Why?" "He's nothing to my mother." He said it like a fact he'd filed long ago and never revisited. "Your mother named him specifically," Dan said, managing to sound sympathetic and immovable at once. "If we could all come to my office, we'll handle this properly. There are rooms designed to make you speak softly." This was one mahogany desk, tall windows, leather that doesn't creak. Diplomas looked down from the walls in their dark frames like well-behaved ancestors. Dustin took the near chair, a territory move. I took the one with the patch of sun. Dan read the formal part with the calm of a man who has watched more families behave badly than the rest of us could imagine. Then he read the bequests, which sounded like a sensible start to a sensible will. House to Dustin, of course. $500,000 to sweeten the math. My son's smile tilted on one corner, the way it had when he learned to smirk at 12 and never unlearned it. And the remainder? Dustin said, as if he were asking about the next course at a restaurant he'd been to often. Dan turned the page. He removed his glasses, polished them on a square of cloth, put them back on. I watched his eyes as much as I watched his mouth. I saw the part of him that knew what came next would change the room. To my former husband, Jerry Michael Flores, he read, I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio. I further transfer to Jerry Flores controlling interest in Flores Consulting Solutions and all subsidiaries, totaling 65% ownership, with immediate appointment as chair of the board of directors. The sentence came like a winter wave, shock first, then cold so deep it remakes the bones. My hearing went strange, his voice did too, as if the words were tunneling through water to reach me. I opened my mouth and something like a laugh escaped, which wasn't laughter at all. It was the sound men make when a building they've been inside for decades suddenly decides to call itself a ruin. Dustin's face found every color between ghost and brick. He stood so fast his chair hit the wall and rocked back into him like a punch. No, he said, and then louder. No, that's absurd. Your mother's instructions were clear, Dan said. He had an extra calm now, the kind doctors use on people who are trying to stand up after anesthesia. She took unusual precautions to ensure they couldn't be challenged. We'll get to that. There's also a letter. Read it, Dustin snapped. Read whatever script he wrote for her. He stabbed a finger at me as if he could pin me to the chair by air alone. I didn't write anything, I said, and knew even as I said it how little weight my honesty carried in his court. Dan opened a manila envelope with the careful fingers of a man who understands the value of paper. He unfolded pages that smelled faintly of the stationery store on Elm, where Bree had once bought thank you cards with violets printed in the corner. He began. My dearest Jerry, he read, and my ribcage went tight because there are ways a person can put your name on a page that tell you've been forgiven. If Dan is reading this, you've just heard something that sounds like a prank played by a bad angel. I would have preferred to tell you myself, but we both know we were too proud and too fluent in silence. So listen, then breathe. He read slowly, and in that voice, hers made of his, there was the woman who used to hold a coffee cup with both hands to warm them even in July. I never stopped loving you. I said the opposite when I was tired and terrified and defending myself with sharp words, but those were temporary truths I mistook for permanent ones. You tried to anchor us to the ordinary, and the ordinary scared me because I mistook it for smallness. I thought if I kept moving fast enough, no one would see the part of me that feared stillness. You were brave enough to be still. I was not. Stop, Dustin said hoarsely, but Dan did not. Dustin, the letter continued. My son flinched as if her handwriting could bruise. If you're in the room, you're angry enough to burn a city. I know. I taught you the chemistry. I taught you to win, and I forgot to teach you how to lose with dignity. You are brilliant. You are also unfinished. I give you the house and money you didn't earn because I'm afraid of making you start from zero. But I do not give you the keys to the vault or the company that ate me alive. If you want empires, build them. Use sweat instead of mine. Dustin made a sound I'd never heard from him, part protest, part something childlike and wounded that split the air and made me taste iron. He turned that hurt into heat the only way he knows. She would never, he said. She would never say these things. She did, Dan said gently, and for a moment I heard a friend in his voice instead of a lawyer. It took a long time for the room to settle after the formal reading. The body knows when it's been struck. It demands a minute. I sat with the letter in my lap, heavy as an infant. Dustin drifted to the window, flung a hand at the street like it had offended him. You're not keeping this, he said finally, without turning around. I'll file. I'll fight you in court until my bones are dust. You'll do what you think you have to, I said, and my voice didn't shake the way it had when we argued in kitchens and doorways years ago. And I'll do what your mother asked me to. What would you know about what she asked? He swung back, sharp as the hinge of a trap. You left. You took your simple life and your simple morals, and you left us to drown in the deep end. I left because neither of us could remember where the ladder was, I said quietly. That's not the same as pushing you in. He stared at me like he'd never seen me, which might be true. We had looked at each other through the fog of verdicts for so long that each of us became our own caricature in the other's eyes, the stubborn plant operator who wouldn't evolve, the ambitious consultant who wouldn't sleep. Somewhere under those cartoons were people who had once traded jokes about cheap pie and redcoats. He left before Dan could say another word, the door closing soft and final and mean as a silk ribbon around a throat. The window frame trembled. The diplomas didn't. Dan cleared his own throat instead. There are practical matters, he said, which is lawyer for welcome back to earth. We'll convene the board. The CFO is steady. Operations are solid. We can ease you in his chair without frightening the horses. I don't know how to ride, I said. Not those horses. You know what to do when a machine hums too loud, he said with a small smile. Companies are machines full of people. They hum and rattle and overheat and stall. You'll hear the music. We'll get you teachers for the rest. If I'm being honest, I slept badly for a week after that. Shock has a long tail. Money is loud when you've lived next to quiet for a long time. I lay awake and counted everything that would now be counted at me. Lawyers knew my name. Account numbers bled into my dreams. The neighbors' beagles howled at trains like they were mourning ancestors, and I envied their certainty. The morning I went to the company for the first time, I wore the good suit again and a tie too tight because the knot made me feel like I'd been handed authority and put on a leash in the same breath. The building had grown since I'd last visited years ago for a charity event, glass that reflected blue sky so earnestly it seemed to apologize for the shadows it made. The receptionist recognized me, which was worse than anonymity. Mr. Flores, she said with warmth that might have been rehearsed or might have been relief. We're glad you're here. She handed me a visitor badge I didn't need anymore and blushed. The elevator was a mirror that forced me to look at myself. My reflection looked like a man entering a place where he didn't speak the language. My heart looked like a mechanic ready to listen to an engine. In the conference room, a dozen faces waited CFO, COO, HR, words that used to slide off my life like raindrops. They stood as one when I entered, which made me want to sit on the carpet and apologize to the furniture. Thank you for coming, said a woman with gray hair coiled at the nape of her neck like a well-organized thought. I'm Clara, Chief Financial Officer. We were all very fond of Brianna. We're ready to support whatever pace you need. I need to go slow, I said. And I need you to pretend you're talking to your granduncle at Thanksgiving. Explain things like I'm not stupid, but I haven't been in the room. There was a small exhale around the table, the kind people make when they've been waiting to see what kind of storm just came across the prairie. They pulled up slides and facts and even stories. I learned where the revenue came from and where it went to hide. I learned that my ex-wife had built a culture that was half steel, half caffeine, and that people had learned to sprint and sleep with their phones under their pillows. I learned the names of the receptionists and a janitor whose son was in the Marines. I asked about benefits. I asked about the interns. I did not ask to see the corner office. It would be cleaner storytelling if I told you Dustin called me that day. He didn't. He vanished the way a man does when he's pulling a rope he thinks will unspool justice from the ceiling. Word reached me from 3 directions that he'd found a litigator with sharp elbows. Dan told me not to panic. She built in safeguards, he said. Neuropsych evaluations. Video of the signing. Independent witnesses. The thing is a fortress. Still, I wrapped her letter in a dish towel and placed it in a shoebox under my bed like a boy guarding a treasure. Some part of me understood that whatever else I was now, I was a man who had been written to kindly from beyond the reach of apology. The first time I visited Brianna's grave, grass hadn't settled yet and the dirt looked like an unmade bed. I said her name out loud and it sounded wrong in the wind. I stood there long enough to become cold and then longer on purpose. I'm trying, I told the temporary marker that would soon become stone. I'm trying to make this look like the thing you meant. Do you want to know what became of Dustin? That is always the second question people ask after they finish being polite about how very surprising the will was. The truth is he spent months thrashing. He filed a challenge that didn't last a full hearing. He went on a podcast and told a story that made me an opportunist and his mother a confused woman robbed by sentimentality. It got shared by people who like their narratives sharp enough to cut bread. Then it got old, because that's what stories do when they're told by people who don't change. I saw him once in the grocery store, of all merciless places. He had a basket with lemons and arugula and an expression that said the lights were too bright. We almost crashed near the cereal. The boxes felt obscene with their cheerful colors. "Dustin," I said, defaulting to the voice I used when he was 8 and mad about homework. "Don't," he said, because grown men don't like that tone unless they're being rescued. We stood there. Other people looked down at their phones, which is the Pacific Ocean you can dive into in public. He pushed the basket forward and then pulled it back, a dance I recognized from when he was little and stubborn and wanted to move and wanted to be carried and couldn't choose between. "She loved you," I said finally, because we needed one true sentence in the aisle between cartoon tigers and marshmallows. "That part's not a debate." He swallowed. His throat worked like a fist opening. "She loved winning," he said, and then lower, bitter and breaking, and I thought I was her trophy. We didn't fix anything next to the granola. But when he walked away, he didn't throw his shoulder into me like a door. At the company, I learned slowly, like a grown-up teaching himself cursive. I didn't pretend to be a visionary. I didn't ask anyone to call me Mr. Chairman, and when someone did, I waved it away like a fly. I sat down with middle managers whose shoes were scuffed from running the stairs. I asked them what they loved about their work and what they hated and what they feared would never change. I asked the CFO to bring me one spreadsheet a day and explain it like a recipe. She started with payroll because that is where people become numbers, and the trick is to remember how to read back into names. The first decision that felt like mine, we added bereavement days for grandparents and best friends. It seemed a small thing, a memo that wouldn't make a magazine list, but a woman from HR cried in my office and told me her sister died last year, and she hid the funeral from her supervisor by calling it a medical appointment. It cost us nothing but the unhooking of a chain. The second decision took more steel in my spine than I expected. I told the board we were closing the office at 6. Phones could ring after that, but not in the building. People needed to go home while the sky was still blue enough to count as day. There was a murmur, the soft murmur of a dozen shoulders adjusting to a new weight. Our COO, a man with a haircut like a parable about efficiency, frowned. "Clients expect, they expect because we train them to," I said. "We'll train them different. We are not a hospital. If a project can't survive until morning, we planned it wrong. You'll be relieved to hear the company did not crumble because of an extra hour of sunlight. In fact, the opposite happened. People made fewer dumb mistakes. They ate dinner with small people who look at you like you are a continent. They slept. They were nicer on elevators. We lost one client who wanted a team available at midnight, and we gained 2 who liked the word humane. Money has a way of creating ghosts if you don't ask it to build anything. In those first months, I refused 3 invitations to events where applause and name tags do the mating dance. I said yes to the city school board instead. We funded a program that puts math tutors in cafeterias before first period. We built a small scholarship not for the kid with the highest GPA, but for the one the custodian says hello to by name because he's there early every morning helping fold chairs. These gestures didn't make headlines. But Mrs. Daly in the office at Lincoln High hugged me like a man being returned from sea, and the janitor cried the way men do when they don't expect to. Lest this sound too neat, know that I mess things up too. I hired a consultant who said all the right words about culture and then tried to measure our souls with a ruler. I almost bought a smaller firm because the slide deck made it look like synergy was an emotion. Clara coughed softly at the board table and said, "Let's spend our money renovating the HVAC and giving the mailroom a window." We did, and 2 months later a man named Arturo, mailroom, 24 years with the company, sports pages folded into fourths on lunch, told me he sleeps better because he doesn't cough all afternoon. I told no one about the day I went home early, took the letter from the shoebox, sat on the bed, and read it straight through with the blinds up so I could be seen by no one and still feel visible. She'd written more than Dan read aloud. She wrote about February nights with apple pie. She wrote about the first apartment and the second house, and the day the dishwasher overflowed, and we used every bath towel and stayed up laughing because the noise of failure was somehow liberating. She wrote about the ugly things we said. She wrote, "I mistook your steadiness for fear. You mistook my fear for courage." I made a copy and put it in my wallet until the fold tore. The original went back into the shoebox. The shoebox went into the closet. I left the closet door open on purpose, because some doors you shouldn't close even if you can. Dustin sent an email with no greeting and no signature the week our attorneys finished untying his last knot. "Fine," it said. "Enjoy your prize." I wrote back, "There is an empty chair next to me at every meeting. It has your name on it if you want to learn how to build." He didn't answer. But the next month he asked Clara for a copy of the quarterly reports out of curiosity. I didn't let myself hope. Then I did. He arrived unannounced on a Wednesday, wearing a shirt that didn't want to be tucked and a face that didn't want to admit it was tired. Clara intercepted him and walked him to my office like a cat escorting a nervous dog past a vacuum. He stood in the doorway and tried on an expression like he was shopping for one. "Do you want coffee?" I said, because men like me need an object to focus on when the important thing is standing 2 feet away. "I don't drink coffee," he said, which made me laugh because he drinks coffee like it's confession and has since 16. The corner of his mouth twitched. He sat. He looked at his hands. He said, "She could be terrifying," and I said, "Yes," and we were silent long enough for that word to understand it was welcome. "I thought I wanted to be her," he said. "Now I'm not sure I want to be anyone." "That's because you don't know yet you're allowed to be a third thing," I said. "What's the third thing?" "Yourself." He rolled his eyes in a small, embarrassed way that reminded me of every time he was 8 and hated a simple answer. Then he surprised me. "Do you think I could sit in the back for a while?" he asked. "Not talk. Just listen." I pretended to consider it because sometimes you need to make a gift feel heavy. "You'll sit in the back," I said. "You'll carry 2 binders and make copies when Clara glares at you. You'll walk with me through the floors and you'll learn people's names and not their titles. You'll take notes at meetings and then you'll take out the trash after them. When you can tell me who is good at their job because they are kind, I'll let you ask a question in public." "I'm 37, he said, as if that were an exemption from apprenticeship. "So was your mother when she made her first intern cry, and I told her that was not a sign of strength," I said, and he winced because he remembered, or maybe because he had become that story for a while. "We start where we start." He did. He actually did. The first week, he didn't speak when he wanted to. The second week, he asked an intern's opinion and didn't correct it out loud. On a Thursday, I watched him refill the paper at the copier like it was a sacrament and felt a ridiculous swell of pride, the kind men feel at Little League when their kid watches the pitch all the way into the glove even when he doesn't swing. 2 months in, he knocked on my door with his knuckles and not his ego and said, "There is a designer in marketing who solves problems by checking in with operations before they become fires. She's better at this than her title allows." I smiled. The third thing had taken its first breath. We didn't become perfect. This is not a parable where angels deliver better habits with the mail. He still bristles when I speak in declaratives. I still want to protect him from pain he needs. Sometimes he misses his mother so hard he wears it like a shirt that doesn't fit in the arms. Sometimes I do, too. I keep her letter within reach. He keeps her photograph face down some days and up on others. We visit the graves separately and together. At Easter, he brought lilies because he learned they were her favorite from a secretary who had watched Brianna buy them for her office and then forget to water them when a contract went wild. He placed the flowers on the grass and told the wind, "We're trying. If you're waiting for villains and punishments, I can offer you a few knockoff versions." The litigator who promised to gut us sent Dustin a bill that he paid with a sour smile. A magazine wrote a piece with a headline that suggested I was a lottery ticket that wandered in off the street. I didn't read it. I put the recycling out on Wednesday and slept 8 hours on Saturday and went to the plant where I worked for 25 years and shook the hands of men who still smell like a mix of metal and honesty. They slapped my back and said, "Look at you," and I said, "Look at me," and we laughed because the thing about friendships built on shift coffee is they don't require you to invent an identity. We did one grand gesture because sometimes you need a headline to get people to listen long enough to teach them a story. We created a foundation in Brianna's name, and we funded it not with a name building but with a string of small mercies, childcare stipends for single parents returning to school, emergency grants for workers whose transmissions die on a Tuesday, grocery cards handed quietly by HR when someone's eyes look like their week has broken. The papers didn't always notice, but a man sent me a letter written in pencil that said, "I didn't have to choose between rent and insulin, and I think your ex-wife would have liked that." I put that letter next to hers in the shoebox. Two truths sharing a small room. I kept the house, which did not belong to me but now did. I didn't move in. I opened the door and let the veterans group we'd worked with, strong women with arms like resolve, men with soft eyes, walk through with tape measures. Soon a crew from the plant showed up on Saturday mornings and built walls that did not shut people in, but gave them privacy and a place to set a mug. We turned Brianna's old office into a library with donated paperbacks and a table where kids draw their future in crayons. The Hillrest neighbors brought casseroles. I stood in the doorway and tried not to cry when a boy who'd never had his own room shut the door and opened it twice just to make sure it obeyed him gently. We put a small plaque by the sidewalk that says, "This home keeps serving." What else? I called the neighbor who'd yelled at me about sprinklers that first day. "Mrs. Henderson?" I said. "It's Jerry from 2B. I fixed the joint. And I have a gardener now." She said, "You always were capable," and I laughed because sometimes compliments wear mean coats, but they still keep you warm. And there is Brianna's letter, which sits now in a safe and still in my chest. When I read it a year later on the anniversary, it had not changed its words, but it had changed their temperature. Grief does that. At first it burns, then it warms. "If you are lucky and you behave, it lights a path." She wrote, "I picked you for a reason. You make heavy things less heavy. Use that." I did not suspect she would ever give me the heaviest thing I could carry, her work, her wealth, the ghost of who she could have been if she had stayed, and ask me to turn it into something useful. I am trying. Sometimes at the office, late but not too late because we go home at 6, I stand in the hallway and listen. Companies have a sound. Ours used to sound like panic folded into excellence. It now sounds like work that can be done again tomorrow, which is the only kind that lasts. I think she would hate that sentence for a minute. Then I think she would admit it was beautiful. When Dustin sits next to me now in board meetings, back row at first, then closer, then at the table when he had earned his question, we argue in an undertone that doesn't frighten people. We've learned to walk out of the room together and keep walking down the block until our sentences run out of steam and we can hand each other the remains. He calls me Dad on purpose sometimes and Jerry on accident when he is trying to be professional. I mail him a photograph every so often, his mother at the lake with her hair wet and the wrong towel, him at 4 with his mouth full of teeth too big for his head, and he rolls his eyes and puts the photos on a shelf he swears he doesn't notice. If you came for a revenge story, I can tell you it's here, but the villain isn't my son and the victory isn't his humiliation. The enemy was the lie we all agreed to for too long, that money proves goodness, that speed is the same as virtue, that leaving or staying makes you righteous all by itself. The payback is softer and more permanent. A company that treats humans like humans, a son learning usefulness by carrying binders, a man in a small apartment who opens a closet and is not afraid of what is inside. I still make coffee in the chipped cup, though I could buy one carved from Moon Rock if I wanted. I still listen to the neighbor's dogs howl for freight trains at 2 a.m. I still visit the grave when the grass is too long and when it is shaved short, and sometimes I take an apple pie from the diner because ghosts like gifts and memory needs rituals. I tell her about the HVAC and Arturo's cough and the scholarship that went to a girl who takes 2 buses to work before school and who writes poems about the smell of engine oil. I tell her I'm doing my job. I say, we made something better than we were, and the wind moves through the cedars like an answer. The day we hung the new sign in the lobby that read Forest Solutions in simpler letters, I stood on a ladder and felt exactly the opposite of dizzy. Dustin handed me the drill and didn't tell me how to use it. Clara watched with a smile like a woman who knows payroll will run and the lights will stay on. People clapped soft at first and then louder because they remembered they were allowed to. I thought of red wool in February and of a card on a diner counter. I thought of a man who once believed he was small and a woman who once believed she had to be big at any cost, and how both of them had been wrong and right in ways that canceled each other's worst tendencies. I climbed down and the room smelled like sawdust. Dustin leaned close enough that only I could hear. Mom would have hated that font, he said, and I laughed, and he laughed, and for a second we were the same age. And if you're still asking how a single sentence from a lawyer made a grown man scream so loudly the walls shook, here is the answer that fits in a sentence of its own, because sometimes the truth is a set of keys handed to the wrong person on purpose, and the person who expected to drive finds himself learning to walk, which is louder than any engine you've ever heard. We locked up at 6. We left the lights on in the lobby, just bright enough for the night guard to read his paperback. We stepped into evening that smelled like cut grass and copy paper and possibility. Earlier that day, a client had asked for a midnight deliverable and we had said, "How about 10 in the morning?" And she had said, "Fine," as if no miracle had just occurred. Dustin glanced at me like he wanted to say something and decided to wait. I decided to wait too. Some sentences are better when you walk a block before you begin. We passed a bus stop where a woman in scrubs looked so tired the moon seemed to lean closer to help. I made a note to ask Clara if our clinic needed another nurse. We passed a sandwich shop. We passed the church with the food pantry. We walked the way people do when they are lining their hearts up with their feet. We did not speak until the corner, where he said, not looking at me, "You know, I do have one question for the meeting tomorrow." And I said, "Good," and that was the end of the day and the beginning of the rest of our work.